All right, good evening, everybody. Glad we could get together for another 13 weeks of study. You know what? I'll just pray and then we'll go over some of this stuff. Lord, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for everyone who is able to make it out. I just pray that you'd be with us during this time, that you would show us some things from your word and help us to understand it and see how it can apply to our lives and to our walk with you. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, so we're studying the book of Exodus this time. And when we studied Genesis, we went through just about verse by verse. I think we skipped a chapter somewhere in the 50 chapters. We're not going to do that this time. There are 40 chapters in the book of Exodus, but we decided instead of stretching it out over another full year, we'll do it a little more thematically. So like tonight we will read the entire chapter. We will still do a ton of Bible reading as you come to expect, but it's going to be a little more theme focused at different times, and we'll kind of zoom in on particular things that are going to be happening and maybe not get to some other stuff as detailed. Now, what I will do is let you guys know from week to week, like what chapters we'll be covering next week. So if anyone does want to I want to read the whole text ahead of time, I'll let you know that. So that shouldn't be a big deal. But, as we move forward, if you've ever tried to read the Bible in a year, somewhere around the middle to end of Exodus is where some people fall off. Once you get 3 chapters in a row about leprosy procedure, sometimes that gets tricky, especially if you're trying to do it devotionally and you're like, what am I doing? So some stuff is going to be covered more like the law, the building of the tabernacle. That will be covered a little bit differently than some of this. But a question I always like to ask, so how familiar are we with the book of Exodus? What do you think of right off the bat with the book of Exodus when you hear that?
The Exodus.
The Exodus. Yes. People of Israel coming out of Egypt. Maybe some plagues. Yeah.
Wall of water split in two.
Yep. Wall of water. Yep. Crossing the Red Sea. 10 Commandments. Yep. Yeah, there are still a lot of laws, a lot of instruction given in the second half of the book. Have we probably all seen a movie about this at some point, whether it's the Charlton Heston 10 Commandments that they play every year. I think that cartoon Prince of Egypt was pretty big when that came out. Tonight, as we normally do for the first lesson, there's going to be some general overview of the book, but mostly, fortunately how this worked out, we're actually going to be able to jump into the text much quicker than we usually do, especially because we already know some stuff from doing Genesis. And then the text will provide us some good opportunities to dig into all the background that's going to set us up for the rest of the study. So I want to do the recap quiz. So that is your secret half sheet there. So this is going to basically be a quiz on Genesis. I know, we had a whole other 1 Corinthians in between, but this will help us see where we're at as far as where we need to catch up to. So I'm going to think of it like musical chairs. I'm going to play a song. When it's done, pencils down, we'll go over the answers. Everybody ready? All right. I guess the more familiar you were with that series, the more nervous you were getting, if you know how the song goes. Recap quiz. I'm sure we all did very well. I think some of them were tricky, hopefully, and they will all be relevant to what we're discussing tonight. Okay, so question 1, hopefully a gimme. Who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? Nailed it. Moses. Yeah, Moses wrote the... There had to have been a better way to do that. No, this is it. Yeah, you're good. Yeah, okay, so Moses wrote the first 5 books, and of course that includes the book of Exodus. So if you're curious, Exodus 24:4, Numbers 33:2, Mark 12:26, and John 5:46 all attest to Moses writing it. The first example actually has Moses being told to, write this down for a memorial for Israel. So it would have been written during Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, which the traditional dating is 1446 BC to 1406 BC. That's the 40-year time frame in the wilderness. And so as a work of Moses, as we'll see when we get into the text, the story picks up right from the end of Genesis. Okay, question 2. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph tells his brother, paraphrase, "You meant it for blank, but God meant it for blank." Do we have those blanks?
Evil and good.
Evil and good, yeah. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That's Joseph talking about his brothers selling him as a slave into Egypt. And then, of course, that whole story turns around, and Joseph ends up being the one to help Pharaoh save a lot of people. So in the book of Exodus, we're going to see the ultimate good that comes from this time as Israel's formed into a true nation and people in Egypt and then the wilderness. Question 3, who received the promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars? Abraham. If you wrote Isaac, that is also acceptable. You got Isaac? Okay, yeah. Jacob had a similar concept, but different metaphor. That's in Genesis 15:5 and Genesis 26:4, Abraham and Isaac respectively. 4, God told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land for how many years? 400. Yeah, 400 years. Many, yes. Yeah, and that's Genesis 15:13 through 16. 5, what were the construction materials used at the Tower of Babel? Brick. Brick is one. Okay. Anyone have the secondary material? So we can say mortar, so brick and mortar. In the Genesis account, Genesis 11:3, they use the word slime, which is odd, but they talk about these slime pits that are prevalent in that area. Even like archaeologically now we can tell that. But that'll come up again, oddly enough. Okay, 6. Who was exalted to second in command in Egypt? Joseph. Yeah, I guess I already mentioned that again in our recap here. And why did the sons of Israel move to Egypt? Famine. Correct. All right, who got 7 right? Well, no one got the... Okay, so you got like 6.5 right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll give you 6.5 because you got the brick. Okay, very good. See, I think that's a much nicer way to recap some material we need to do. Okay. So, under the introduction, we already talked about familiarity with the book. We already talked about how we're going to approach this study. Oh, something at the end of that, how to approach this study. We remember a lot from Genesis. Super fast recap. Genesis started with union with God in Eden, then union lost through sin, the fall, they were cast out of the garden. And in that, there was a promise of someone who would crush the head of the serpent. Then we see the growing wickedness of man, which results in the flood. We have a pinnacle event of rebellion at the Tower of Babel, where God confuses the languages and disperses the people. And at that point, God chooses one man through whom he will bring about the snake crusher prophecy, which is Abraham and his family. And if you recall, and I don't even know if we really touched on this when we studied Genesis, the book sort of ends with I'll call it first blank on your page. Genesis ends with an uneasy hope. And what I mean by that is, as the whole story wraps up, it's like it's a good, positive end to the story. You have Joseph as your last, really good character. All the children of Israel are safe in Egypt. They've been given land. They have the Pharaoh's blessing, all that. But we talked about how Abraham was told that his descendants would be in bondage in a foreign country for 400 years, and that he would bring them out again. But as you end the story of Genesis in Egypt, it's sort of is a good, happy ending, and you get the family restoration and all that. But if you remember the events of Abraham, you're going, yeah, but something bad's about to happen, right? This isn't going to be just happily ever after right here. So there's this kind of uneasy hope at the end of it. So what I want to do is we'll just jump into the text. I want to read the first 7 verses. There's not a ton in the first 7 verses. I'll still ask your thoughts. Exodus chapter 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now again, I know that's not a lot for you to work off of, but I'll give you the opportunity. Any thoughts there? Anything that jumps out at you? Yes. Yep, the Israelites are multiplying, and even though they probably wouldn't have geographically literally been all over the land because they're in their area of Goshen that Joseph got them, they are just being blessed and multiplying. Those are all the children of Israel. And then we see that there end up being about 70 in total that go into Egypt. And I should have wrote it down. Late in Genesis, when they're making that trip down into Egypt, there's actually a very specific chapter that I'm sure we skipped when we studied through it, that you're dealing with sons, wives, so these sons, their sons, and at some point grandchildren. So there's a whole big clan all stemming from Jacob going down into Egypt. All right, so on your sheet, we already went over thoughts. Keep in mind, this chapter covers multiple centuries of history. Okay, so especially as we move forward, it's going to be important to remember that you're recapping, again, almost about 400 years in this opening chapter. And that'll just be important for how we frame what is going on and when it's going on. And we'll start to notice a slight perspective shift as the author, Moses, starts pulling the story into his time frame. Obviously when he's writing stuff in Genesis, it takes place way before Moses is alive. And we kind of see just in a very quick chapter, everything's just kind of getting pulled forward, and there's more of like a shift to the present day, which is just interesting to note. So verse 7. Verse 7 is interesting. I'll read it again. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Okay, does this remind you of anything from the book of Genesis?
Adam and Eve.
Oh, be fruitful and multiply? Yeah, right. So, yeah, and like you were meant, so yeah, both of those things. God to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. After the ark, like you were saying, Noah is given the same be fruitful and multiply type command/blessing. But also the promise to all the patriarchs that God is going to multiply the seed of Israel like the stars of heaven, like the sand on the seashore. He's going to bless them. And to an extent, we start seeing this just in their over-the-top blessing and abundance, even in a foreign land. So we see God's faithfulness to his promise to the patriarchs. But what ends up being really interesting, and I think we're kind of hitting on it with some of the, especially the creation stuff, this little table sort of thing that I printed out for us. So this verse is riffing off of Genesis 1:21 through 22. So in both of these verses, the same three Hebrew verbs show up. So you have the Hebrew, what it means, and then both sets of verses. So both verses use the Hebrew para. In Genesis, we see that means be fruitful, be fruitful and multiply. Were fruitful, same Hebrew. The next column or the next paragraph is sharatz, which can mean to swarm, team, multiply abundantly. So Genesis has bring forth abundantly. Exodus, it ends up being translated increased abundantly. The Hebrew word rabbah, to multiply. Genesis, it's multiply, and Exodus, it's multiplied. So interestingly enough, you would think, oh, this must be like, in the creation account, this must be, people. No, oddly enough, this is coming from a verse that's talking about the birds and the fish. And so you could easily, like, especially with the birds and the fish, make it translate sharatz to like, they swarmed, they teamed, this idea of like, it's not just multiplying, it's like when you see a fish tank full of fish that are like all, or, an ocean shot. And Moses uses the exact same words to talk about what God is doing with Israel as they are just like overflowing with the blessing to Adam and Eve, to Noah, and to the patriarchs. So in the Hebrew, he's really painting a picture of, like, you're supposed to be sort of linking this, it's in a metaphorical sense, analogical sense, it's like a little creation narrative that's happening here. It's kind of linking us back to the original creation narrative. Unfortunately, if you're familiar with the original creation narrative, there's quickly going to be a problem that needs to be resolved. So Moses is kind of just playing around with those themes there. We good with that? Okay. All right, so the next thing I want to look at is Israel in servitude, and that's going to be verses 8 through 14, and this might be stuff that you are more familiar with. Exodus 1:8. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. All right, what jumps out at you with those verses? What do you see? Egypt is bad. Yeah. Yeah, they were free from the time of Joseph until whenever this king imposes this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Does the king have a name?
I'm sure he does.
But we don't know.
We don't know. And next week, when we get into Moses, that king, Pharaoh, is more identifiable because we have a timeline, you know. The problem that I think a lot of us are seeing with this paragraph is what king and when. Like the when is the big thing. You know, if you have a timeline of any kind, you can do some pretty good guessing. You know, if you're reading a book and they say, oh, the American president in 1780, you can go, like, even if they don't name him, if you have a timeline, you go, oh, it was Washington, I guess, probably. I don't know. Yeah, that's what makes this paragraph and this chapter really very difficult to nail down with much specificity, because we just don't know at what point any of this is happening. And that's why I pointed out in the last section, and I point out again here, 400 years of history is happening basically in chapter 1. And we don't know where in those 400 years everything happens. All right, anything else there? I mean, I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the questions you have. Yeah, it's an interesting form of oppression because it's not just about getting free labor, like because he tells you what his purpose is. I'm sure they were not upset about getting free labor for their empire, but it was more of like a population control, a morale control, like just a general, let's get them under our thumb in some way to hopefully make sure this isn't a problem for us in the future. Okay, so, on our sheet, I said, again, recall that this is taking place over the course of roughly 400 years. There is time to forget Joseph, multiply, be brought into bondage, build cities, and multiply further. So this is all happening over a very long period of time. Now, I think I already told you this in the quiz, but context, when is this happening? The traditional date of the Exodus event is placed at approximately 1440 BC. Okay, so they would have gotten to Egypt about 400 years before that. All right, so verses 8 and 9. How does someone forget Joseph? We talked about this a little bit, but any other ideas with this? Like, how do you forget Joseph? What were the ones we had on the table? Just ignorance of history type thing? What were our other hypotheses? Because that would be an interesting question. So we have tons of hieroglyphics from Egypt. We have lists of pharaohs from Egypt. How many lists of like second in commands from Egypt do we have? Like, maybe we do. I'm not aware of them. So there, some of it could be just rational, like what, how many vice presidents can you go back, especially if you're talking 100 years ago. Like, I don't know. Yeah, so the question is, how do you forget Joseph, and who was it? Okay, so the honest answer, no idea on either count. However, I have this, it's a school textbook from the Bible college days, and it's a really good book because it's the history of Israel, but it's written like a history book, like any history book that you would read, and it brings in the biblical accounts, of course. It's especially cool when you're reading about like the conquests, the life of David, and like all the battle stuff is always very interesting, and it kind of puts it in helpful terms. So there's a theory, only a theory, but I like it personally. So there was a group, and you don't need to remember this, there was a group of people known as the Hyksos rulers in Egypt. So the Hyksos rulers were a small but politically powerful and elite group that started ruling in parts of Egypt around 1770 BC. They were a Semitic people who gained wealth and influence in the land and eventually expelled legitimate Egyptian rulers in the northern regions of the country. For reference, Goshen, where Israel lived, was very near to where the Hyksos capital was established. They were expelled in 1550 BC. So this theory states that this new dynasty that is ruling in the northern part of Egypt knew nothing about Joseph and did not care. And the next blank on your sheet, this also makes sense of the population concerns as well. Because it's difficult, again, just the way this is written, it's difficult to know when these concerns come about. All we know is that before the slavery ever takes place, whoever's in charge is concerned about the population size of the Israelites. But then after however long in slavery, they multiply more. And then we'll see them multiply again as we finish out the chapter. So whatever the time frame is here, they're at their smallest big multitude blessing that they're going to be. So this idea is this foreign group that gained prominence in Egypt probably wouldn't have cared at all, either known or cared what arrangement some old pharaoh that we just kicked out made with this other guy. And I think it makes good sense of their population concerns, because by the time Israel is exiting, let's say, yeah, they could be like, if they were armed, you're like, ooh, Israel and Egypt population, big problem. However many hundreds of years back this is, I don't know if they would have been as big of a concern to Egypt proper, but to an elite, small ruling class, you go, hey, like if that old dynasty, the actual Egyptians try to come back in, you don't want them teaming up with them because we're this small little Semitic usurping group. Another idea, all roads kind of lead back to the Hyksos in some theory or another. Another idea is that when the Egyptians finally expelled the Hyksos rulers, the new leadership mistrusted non-Egyptians in their country and put them in servitude. But this would only give the situation of slavery about 100 years or so. So it depends on how literally you take God's statement to Abraham that they will, be in like servitude for 400 years. If you are fine with them just being like, they're in the foreign land for 400 years, part of it's going to be really rough towards the end. If you require it to be like basically the whole time in bondage, then, one theory or another. And then there are plenty of other theories, but yeah, this odd Semitic ruling class that took over parts of Egypt always crop up in some form or fashion in the theories of when this would have taken place and why this would have taken place. Oh, Well, I mean, they don't explicitly state it in the text. I don't know if they were smaller. Well, okay, let's throw this out there. I have no idea how common weaponry was among your common everyday peasants in the ancient world. You know, we watch a movie and everyone's walking around with swords and shields, but I don't know that your standard farmer was armed to the hilt. They didn't have their own government, so I don't... Yeah, text doesn't say... Honestly, the text doesn't even really say necessarily that they were unarmed, but it does indicate that it would be a problem if an invading nation came in. So it doesn't seem like whether they were armed or not initially, it doesn't seem like it was of any effect on like taking over Egypt or something like that. Okay, so now the nature of Israel's slavery. We got to move quick with some of these last ones. So how do you read what's going on here? Like, what does this look like, do you think? And I think we have a really odd historical view of slavery. Like, when we hear the word slavery, we think about the transatlantic slave trade with the West and Africa. So not that didn't happen to a certain extent in the ancient world. Like, for example, Joseph is essentially kidnapped and sold and bought by an individual master. Like, okay, so that we recognize that general principle. But what would happen, and what seems to be happening here, is not so much that. We're not like really looking at a whole bunch, like maybe there were some slaves of that nature. But as far as like individual buying and selling, what we seem to have here is not that, but government forced labor for means of oppression, control, and massive building projects. So they were more of second or third class citizens, forced by government taskmasters to be the laboring class. They would have few, if any, rights and no freedom. Example that we'll see later, they can't leave unless they have Pharaoh's permission to leave the country. But very different from our modern understanding of what slavery looked like. Does that make sense? Good? Okay. So it's more of like a whole class, like this is the serf class, and they just have very little rights and can't make decisions for themselves, and they work the fields and they do the building projects and that kind of thing. Okay, let's finish out the chapter here with a genocidal policy. All right, verses 15 through 22. And the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Sifra and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. If it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men and children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, why have you done this thing, and have saved the men and children alive? The midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they're lively, and delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. All right, quick thoughts? That is a very good point. Yeah, the males are probably doing most of the like hard labor. I'm sure they had men and women like doing the field work as far as who's stacking those giant bricks besides the aliens. Probably the slave men, you know. Yeah, and that's how the progression normally goes. You know, you silence a people, you imprison a people, and then at the end we'll just kill people. Well, you can get the idea that like okay, the USSR relied heavily on neighbors spying on neighbors and turning them in, and also in the ancient world, like in many parts of the world today, life was not always treated as sacred. You know, as much as we like the Spartans in like modern movie depictions and for their stoic sayings, they typically just discarded children who were not seen as like the strongest ones. Like,
Kind of like the ones that are litter.
yeah, yeah, or like you know how you would like kill like you're growing like some sort of fruit or vegetables and you like you prune certain things so that the nutrients go to the others. They were known for like this happened in many cultures. You leave the kid in the woods, you know toss him off a cliff.
Right down, get them.
Yeah,
Or maybe somebody will pick them up and take them home, but yeah, they just left them.
yeah. It was startlingly common.
And
Like
they do child sacrifice at that point either? in Egypt?
I don't know if Egypt was big into child sacrifice, but I'm sure that will come up as we look at the religion a little bit more. But they're not known for it in the way that like Baal, like Molech.
Canaanites and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah. So on your sheet here, so it's hard to say exactly what is going on here, when it's going on, and for how long. Because yeah, you got to think to what Cindy was saying with like, well, this is your slave population. You're going to kill all the men? That's your plan here. So it's like, okay, how widespread was this command? Because okay, he's talking to two midwives. You have to assume that they are in like, I don't know, like when you think of the Surgeon General. Like I don't know, are these like the top midwives who all the other midwives report to and something like? Because you wouldn't expect two midwives to like cull the entire population of the Hebrews. So was this, like you mentioned, was this like a temporary thing? Was it more of to put your thumb further on the Hebrew people? Like, okay, we're gonna do this for a time, and then like this just cruelty to kind of keep them further down. Yeah, we have no idea. All we know is that on your sheet here, the most we know is about the faithfulness of the midwives, and that this policy will be in place at the birth of Moses. So when we read about Moses in the next chapter, we see the policy still in place to whatever extent it's in place. Considering the chapter, we only have about 5 minutes left. So I put, after discussing the chapter, how do you think it fits tonight's title, which I realize I don't even think I mentioned? Faithfulness in the midst of suffering. Yeah, you know what's interesting about the Exodus, though, is it's really not presented as punishment for sin. Like, while there are many parallels between the Exodus and the Babylonian exile, the Babylonian exile is distinctly for hundreds of years of horrendous sin by the kings and the nation. This is not presented that way in the least. While they will definitely have their rough spots, especially when they get to the desert, the Exodus event is not framed as punishment for anything, which is interesting. Now, one thing I realized I skipped it as I moved on to these last verses on your sheet there. It's in one of our questions, but I'll just kind of throw this out there. Right on your page before the genocidal policy, verse 14, I said, notice the building materials. Verse 14, they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick and in all manner of service in the field. Okay, so you might think I'm being, finding connections where there are none. So in Hebrew, it is the exact same words that Genesis translates as the brick and slime. The translators had a specific reason for using slime in that it's a whole thing. These are the only two verses in the Bible where these words show up, and they show up together in both contexts. So in Genesis, in that kind of primeval history, like chapters 1 through 11, Babel, we don't really think of it typically that way, but Babel is like a pinnacle rebellion of all mankind coming together against God. And they're using this brick and mortar to build their tower of rebellion, essentially. And we already said that what Moses is doing in Exodus 1:7 is kind of framing this multiplication as like a new creation Edenic blessing over the children of Israel. And we know what follows creation, that's the fall. And he frames it using the same language from Babel. So geographically, the children of Israel are in Egypt. In a spiritual sense, they are in a greater, worse Babel situation. They are, at this point, victims to what we will find to be an incredibly wicked, rebellious king. And we've already seen how some of these kings are very evil. So all this is going to play out, and through the children of Israel being subject to the evil of the world, God is going to bring redemption and salvation. And most of the language that we as Christians use for salvation has its origins in the book of Exodus. You know, salvation is foreshadowed and talked about in Genesis, and we went over that in depth. But the direct language that we get, like even just salvation and redemption, all come from the book of Exodus. This is where the Passover comes into play and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, Israel is seen as a victim of the evils of the world posed against God, and God will bring redemption to his people and judge evil. So we really get like a whole gospel thing in the story of the Exodus. So I think that's a little bit of what's going on with this book. So for contemplation, this is the thing I will email out to you unless you request otherwise, just to remind you of it throughout the week. For contemplation, the Israelites were multiplying even in oppression. Are there areas in your life where you only see hardship but might be missing signs of God's unseen faithfulness? 2, how does your faith respond when God's promises seem delayed or when circumstances seem to contradict his plan? And 3, Israel thrived even in slavery. How has hardship shaped you spiritually? Do you see suffering as something that can grow your faith, or do you see it only as burden? Something to think about this week if you so choose. But yeah, faithfulness in the midst of suffering. Next week, I believe we'll cover chapters 2 and 3. So if you're reading ahead, you probably can't go wrong with chapters 2 and 3. All right, I will close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this time in your word. We thank you that we can understand it, and thousands of years after it's written, it still strikes a note. And Lord, I just pray that you would help us to consider some of the deep truths that come out of your word, and I pray you'd be with us in that. Lord, I pray you'd bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.